So we saw what is the default constructor. We saw what is parameterized and what is copy constructor. Today we will be seeing the examples and let us programmatically understand each one of them, the types of constructors. So first one is the default constructor. As you can see, the default constructor will have zero arguments or no argument at all. And basically it's used to assign default values to any newly created object, right? So in my main, if I go ahead to create a object A1 of my A class, A1, A2, and I don't pass any arguments to it, that means my default constructor will be invoked and say, suppose I am having two data members X and Y of the A class. Those will be initialized with some default value. Now that default value can be 0, the default value can be 0 0.0 depending upon the type of X and Y, right? The default value can not only be 0, it can be anything. Suppose I want to put a default value for X and Y as 5, so I can do it, right? That is why it says that used to assign default values to newly created objects, uh, which is the main responsibility of our default constructor, right? So that is how it goes. Yeah, a few points to note, very important ones. It says that we discussed that if there is no default constructor that we have written in our code, then the compiler will create the default constructor, right? The compiler adds a default constructor uh, to our code, right? Only when the programmer has not written any constructor. That means, suppose if my program has a parameterized constructor, maybe it is accepting two integer values and it is assigning X with A and Y with B, right? So, and here I end my class. Then I go ahead and I create an object of A1, right? In this case, we are expecting which constructor to get called? The default one. But have we defined the default constructor? No. So in this case, we cannot expect the compiler to create the default constructor for us, right? Because we already have a constructor, a parameterized constructor. So it is expected that we should also define a explicitly define a default constructor for us. If this constructor was not there, this default constructor was not defined by us in the class, and definitely this was also not there, then in that case, the compiler would have created the default constructor for us. Got it? So very important point to note. Now, if the programmer writes any constructor in the code, then the compiler doesn't add any other constructor. That is what we have discussed, right? And definitely if you're expecting that I won't write the parameterized constructor and I'm creating an object A2 by passing 3 and 4 to it. So now the constructor will be created by the compiler. No, only the default constructor is created by the compiler. Understood? Not the parameterized constructor. Any doubt in this? Anyone? Fine. Moving ahead, parameterized constructor. We discussed it. Constructors that are having specific number of arguments to be passed, right? Specific number and type of arguments to be passed. The purpose of any parameterized constructor is to assign user wanted specific values, right? What we did in default constructor, we initialized x and y with some default value, whatever it is, maybe a non-zero value, fine, but it is not defined by the user. It is not specified by the user. We are hard coding it, right? But if we want the user to do it, then what we can do from the main is we can firstly see in a couple of variables a and b, right? Let a be both be of integer type, and then we can create an object of a class, then pass a and b values to it, so that the appropriate constructor gets invoked, right? So this is how I am making sure that user enters the values with which I want to initialize my data members of the given object A1. Understood? So that is the main motive behind using a parameterized constructor, to be able to initialize data members with user defined values. Right? Okay. And definitely we already saw that the parameterized constructor will never be created automatically by the compiler. It has to be explicitly written by the user, I mean by the programmer in the code. Yeah, same point is there. The parameterized constructor has to be written explicitly by the programmer. Okay. Okay, we have a code just in order to see the demonstration. We will see execution of this code. So I'm using the editor, W3 Schools editor, online editor there is. So what code? I hope y'all are able to see the code. I zoom it a bit.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Zoom it, sir.
Visible now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so we have a class A in which we have two data members, private data members A and B. And in the public part, we have created a parameterized constructor. Now what that parameterized constructor is doing, it is initializing A with X, B with Y. And then we are printing out a statement. Parameterized constructor is called uh, for our acknowledgement. We are printing this statement. Fine. We close the constructor, we close the class, and then we instantiate our class. That means we are creating an object of our class and we are passing two values so that the parameterized constructor gets invoked. And there, if we run it, you can see uh, the values will be initialized, A and B will be initialized, and the given message would get printed. Fine. So let us try to create another constructor over here. Uh, let me try to create another object A2, and let us see. Now A2 is of default type, right? So default constructor should get called. But am I having a default constructor in my
No,
code?
sir.
No.
So
No,
it
sir.
should give me an error. Why should it give me an error? Yeah, there we go. So what's the error? You can read here on the right side. For A2, it is showing an error, no matching function for the call. This one, the destructor, sorry, the constructor, default constructor, right? We don't have any matching function, it says. Why it was so? Anyone? Just now we
The,
discussed.
the compiler did not generate any default constructor because we had a parameterized
We
constructor.
already had a, yeah, exactly. But if I remove, or let me comment this, I'll comment the parameterized constructor. So there's no question of creating an object with parameters. If I try to create an object now of default type, then it should create the object for me. Although we would not see any output because the message won't be printed, but definitely the object would be created. Yeah, you can see no output displayed on the right side because we certainly don't have a control over what should be printed. The constructor was created by the compiler. Clear? Fine. I hope it is clear now. Any doubt in this? Very important points.
No, sir.
Okay, fine. Third type is a copy constructor. We yesterday discussed about copy constructors. Why we use a copy constructor? Only when we require a copy of any object. So the copy constructor is used when we have to create a copy of an existing object of the same class type, right? So the format goes, since it is a constructor, class name would be the constructor name. It is having argument type of the same class, ampersand name of local name for the object, right? So it creates a new object which is exact copy of the existing object, right? Now how do we invoke it? We saw, we have an example over here. Have an example. So here what I am doing, I am having a copy constructor. Name of the class is A, so my constructor name is A. The object that this constructor is going to accept. So like a parameterized constructor was going to accept two integer values. Here the copy constructor is going to accept which type of values? A type of values, not int type of values. Okay, because what we saw, we have to create a copy of the existing object, and that existing object will be passed as parameter from the main. So here when I create A2 object, I am passing A1 as an argument, that is already created object. So this A1 is of which type? Is of A type. That is why A is mentioned here, right? Again, we had discussed in depth why this ampersand is required, simply because I'm repeating it again. In the memory, if I want here object A1 is created with its own A and B. These are data members. Okay. Now definitely A is initialized with 10 considering these two parameters, and B is initialized with 20. Right? Now we are trying to create A2 and we want A's value to be of A1's A and A2's B should be A1's B. Right? But in the process, if we just write, if we create a constructor ampersand O or obj, whatever it is, if we don't mention this ampersand, only we mention the object, that means we are creating yet another object called as obj, which would have its own A and B. And the values are coming from this A, since we are accepting it, we are passing it by value. So obj's A and B would be same as A1's A and B, that is 10 and 20. Over here, when I say obj.A and obj.B, that means they are obj's A and B, with which I am initializing A2's A and B, right? So this is getting created in this way, which I don't want. I want A2's A and B should be initialized with A1's A and B and not obj's A and B. That is why if I don't want this object to be created, I have to mention a ampersand, so that obj is a reference variable. It's a reference object, I would say. To which object it is referring? It is referring to A1 object, which was passed from here. Right? Now, if I say obj A, it is indirectly saying a1 dot a, a1 dot b, whose values I am transferring to a2's a and b, right? So that is why we need to mention a ampersand over here. Okay. So we have a copy constructor in which we have done the initialization with the existing object's help, and then we have printed out a message, fine. And we have a parameterized constructor as well, so no issue about that. Let us try to clear a few points over here which are important. This code first. So here, firstly, the parameterized constructor called message should get printed since we are creating a1 in a parameterized way, and then a copy constructor should get invoked for a2 object, right? Okay, what? Yeah, I think I have to.
Sir, there are no header files.
Aren't they? Oh. In the standard namespace. Yeah. So first the parameterized constructor is called, followed by the copy constructor. Now here, observe one thing. I can create the object if I want to use the existing object. Instead of passing it in bracket, I can even do it in this way. A2 is equal to A1. Okay. So how A2 is initialized? A2 is initialized with A1. So again, you would see the copy constructor is getting called, right? Okay, no issue. But if I create A2 in the default way, and then here below, suppose I try to initialize A2 with A1, right? I'm not initializing because A2 already got initialized over here when the constructor was called for it, but I'm assigning A2 with A1 over here. Okay. Now, obviously, we require a default constructor also in this case. Quickly create a default constructor so that A2 should get created. So it's fine. Create a default constructor, right? But only the parameterized and default constructors are called. No copy constructor is called over here. Understand this now. Whenever we initialize a object with another object at the time of its declaration, then the copy constructor is called. Whenever we try to assign an object to another object, that means this is not the declaration step, but it is a normal assignment that we are doing, right? It is similar to doing something like this. It's int a semicolon and then a equals to b, right? This is what we are trying to do, right? So in this case, what would happen? The copy constructor will not be called. On the contrary, it will try to search for a function which is overloaded assignment operator, because assignment operator usually works with built-in types, right? And now the assignment is being done between which two types? Between the user defined types. So here I need to have a function operator, assignment operator, to which I'm going to pass an object of a type, right? So I'll write here a ampersand o, right? What task we have to do over here? The same task. Whatever the copy constructor did, the same task should be done. Okay. So A's, I mean, A1's, sorry, A2's A should be initialized with A1's A, and A2's B should be initialized with A1's B, right? That is what we did over here. Yeah, we'll say that operator will display a message something like this. Now, if you go ahead to execute this code, you will see that this message should get displayed, because we any problem with this?
The return type.
Yeah, return type. Yeah, we are returning nothing, so we'll keep the return type as void. Fine. Then we see operator equal to called. Now, from this, you should understand that whenever I try to initialize an object with another object at the time of declaration, then the copy constructor is called. But whenever I try to assign the value of one object to another object after the declaration, then it tries to find out a overloaded function and not the copy constructor. Clear?